Welcome to Advocates for Truth. I'm Bob Tyler, Netta Higuera, one of our lawyers at Advocates for Faith and Freedom, former Muslim, Palestinian, now Christian, and she has a real interesting perspective on our topic today. What we want to talk about is what's happening in Israel and how should we be looking at it from a biblical perspective. Advocates for Truth is about bringing a biblical perspective on all things current, what's happening today in the world. Pastor Tom Hughes is a good friend with 412 Church. It's a great movement, as well as Hope for Our Times. It's a ministry that he's launched, and please go take a look at his website and follow him. You're on YouTube and social media.
I'm on YouTube when they let me.
Yeah, that's true. It's been censored a time or two.
Yeah.
Or 10. Rabbi Barclay. Rabbi Barclay is a former client of mine who we represented and have continued to represent. He's such an ally to those of us in the evangelical world. He is a rabbi of near Simcha. It is a temple in Westlake Village, right, Rabbi?
Correct.
And so Rabbi is such a wonderful guy. And Rabbi, do you have any location you would want people to be looking you up?
Sure. They can go to our website, which is nearsimcha.org. They can go to our Facebook page. They can look up my name for Facebook or YouTube, and they'll find our temple channel. And they can, we stream our services. We have classes. We have the Torah sermons, all sorts of things on them.
So near Simcha is spelled Nearsimcha, right?
Correct.
All right. Okay. So, hey, let's jump to it. So first of all, there's lots of controversy, and there are riots, not riots, but protests in the street in Los Angeles. We've seen Jewish people attacked in social media just last week. It was put out there on video as to people who were protesting what's going on over in Israel, and we see a lot of things that are happening, a lot of controversy here in the United States and elsewhere with regard to this battle between Hamas over there in the Palestinian territory with Israel. So first of all, let me ask you, Rabbi, you might know well, what's the current status? There was a ceasefire announced a few days back, right?
Correct. And I'm not there right now, so I can only comment on what I've been told from people who are there, people in the Knesset, friends, etc. There is a ceasefire, which is meaningless, honestly. It's a respite. It's not a ceasefire. This is not an armistice. This is not peace.
Why is that?
Because Hamas has become funded so thoroughly through Iran and with the help of President Biden. It has become so, that's where the rockets come from. And they are committed to the destruction of Israel. In the charter of Hamas, it very specifically says that the world will not be redeemed. The day of judgment will not come until all the Jews are killed and hide behind trees.
What
That's
will
part
not?
of Hamas. Excuse me? It literally says that it will, if you want, I can look up the exact quote, but it says that the day of judgment will not come until all the Jews are killed and they're hiding behind trees.
What is the day of judgment referred to?
Their form of heaven, whatever I try and stay away from Islamic scholarship because I'm not an Islamic scholar, but it's part of their charter is that the definition of Palestine includes from the river to the sea.
Can I ask Netta real quick, since Netta is, formerly a Muslim, what is the Day of Judgment?
Very similar to the Christian Day of Judgment, and but when you go before God and you stand before Him and give it's a works-based faith, so you give an accord of what you've done that's good and bad, and just that your last day.
Okay. Pastor Tom, do you have any other current insight on what's happening right now in Israel? Is this ceasefire going to hold? What have you heard?
Well, I think it will hold for a while. I look at it from maybe a broader perspective, I still look at the Abraham Accords as not being dead. In fact, I think that there's still some life in that. So when I look at it, I bring Iran into the picture. I'm going to bring in these different nations into the picture, because the entire Mideast is affected not just by Israel, but by everything that's going on over there. So so when I come from that perspective, I look at it this way, Bob, that the Abraham Accords have had some success because there's a much bigger enemy in Iran. You know, Iran helped to fund Hamas and Hezbollah, so we understand that. So it's awful to see what's happening, but this has also given the encouragement to these other Arab communities to say, look, we want protection from Iran. So you do have this part of the Abraham Accords that I'm telling you, the Abraham Accords aren't dead yet. But
and the Abraham Accords, real quickly, is this essentially a peace deal that was organized through the Trump administration with Saudi Arabia, and who else was a part of that?
Well, Saudi Arabia, not yet, but
not yet.
Yeah, there are. I believe there's 5 other Arab communities that are part of it.
Nations.
Qatar, I think, Qatar, I believe is one. The UAE, I believe, first got involved. And granted, there's money involved. There's a lot of different things involved.
Yeah.
But when you look at it, you really have 2 different attempts at peace: the Hamas-Iran attempt versus this other way. And look, this other way is just awful. What we see is people being killed. We see Palestinians being killed. We see Jews being killed. It's awful to watch what has happened. As far as the current peace agreement goes,
Abraham
I believe.
the Abraham Accords.
Oh, okay. Let me go back to the other one, the current one, just with the recent
Ceasefire.
one.
Ceasefire.
Yeah,
okay.
ceasefire. Thank you very much. I believe it's going to hold for a while, because these things do happen. I think 2006 there was similar, 2014. Now this, it will hold for a while, but I'm looking at the whole picture of the dynamics of not just Israel and the West Bank, but the entire Mideast and what is coming. And I don't believe that the Abraham Accords are dead. I believe that there's still life in it, and that will move forward. But there's a lot of problems over there.
And I'd like
The
to
Abraham,
just,
Bob, if I can interject for a sec, the Abraham Accords are amazingly miraculous. One of the things that I've heard from people involved in the military and others in Israel is that the expectation is that the ceasefire is not going to last till the 2022 elections, because God willing, there's a red wave. They know that they will lose a lot of support. Hamas and Hezbollah will lose a lot of support, and they want to take advantage while there's pressure in the U.S. that's backed up by Congress to put pressure on Israel. So that there's a whole strategy involved in that, just like there's a strategy that Hezbollah is watching very, very carefully what's going on with Hamas to see if they want to jump in and get into conflict too.
So this information, I think, just to kind of validate what you guys are saying, is really coming from right in Israel. I know, Tom, you know a lot of people in Israel, from politicians to people in the military, Rabbi Barclay, people in the Knesset, et cetera. So I think, you know, you guys bring a lot of credibility to the table with regard to what's happening locally. Okay, let's jump to the next question. This is a question for lots of debate within the Christian world, let's say. And maybe it's not lots of debate, but there's a significant difference within Christendom as to this question. Is Israel, the Jewish people of Israel, are they still God's chosen people?
Is that a question for me? I'll take it first.
You want to take it? Because you go ahead. Go ahead.
I know. Okay, no, Rabbi Barclay, you go first. Then I'll go.
I'm not going to have a lot of
Rabbi
comments on
Barclay
it.
is biased.
No, I'm not going to. You don't know that. So the answer is, the simple answer is yes, but chosen for what is the next question. But what we say is, Am Yisrael Chai, the people of Israel will always live. But there's it's repeated over and over in Torah. There is a context for that. Are the chosen people, so to speak, which I don't even actually like that term, but we have an obligation. We are in marriage with Hashem, with God. And like any marriage, there's a contract. And if we keep our part of the contract, God will keep God's part. When we don't is when we get into problems. And we are persecuted. Judges have to come. You can look at the book of Judges for it. But, you know, people talk the Jews are chosen. We're beloved with God, but part of that is there's a responsibility that we have to keep our agreement. We have to keep our obligation. And when we don't, it's like a rejected lover.
And that's throughout Scripture. It speaks of that. I'll point out in a couple places where in Scripture, in Ezekiel, let me see if I can find that real quick. In Ezekiel, speaking of the chosen people, the prophecy says, look, I'm not doing this for you. I'm doing this for my name's sake. I'm going to restore you, but I'm doing it for my name's sake.
Yeah.
Look, the whole book of Judges is the same pattern. Everything's fine. The Jews forget to start to keep worshiping God in the right way and acting the right way. And suddenly bad things happen to them. They pray because they're so upset, and a judge comes. And that gets over and over and over repeated. So,
Tom, what were you going to say?
You know, Tom, that's the Jewish perspective. So I can now step out while the three of you can get in a fight about the other parts.
Okay, so I think you hit some really good points. Is what were the Jews chosen for? They are God's chosen people. I mean, how you can deny that no matter what part of the theological perspective you have, you can't, because God had to choose a people, and he chose Abraham, Isaac, Jacob for the land. However, he also chose a people for the Messianic covenant, the Davidic covenant. You can read about that. So the Messiah had to come from a people, and God chose the Jews. So that's pretty hard to debate those two things. Jesus, this is what confuses a lot of Christians, Rabbi Barclay. I don't know if you've come across this. There's a lot of Christians that are really confused. They can't believe that Jesus was Jewish, but it's the strangest thing. But God did choose the Jewish people for that. Bob, you were quoting from Ezekiel chapter 36.
Yes.
And this is what God says: you have profaned my name. I scattered you among the nations. You are dispersed, hence the diaspora, throughout the countries. I judged them according to their own deeds, their own words and deeds. When they came to the nations, wherever they went, they profaned my holy name. When they said of them, these are the people of the Lord, and yet they have gone out of his land. But God says, I had concern for my holy name. And because of my covenant, I will bring them back into the land. So that's Ezekiel chapter 36.
Can I add to that? I want to read just one scripture, and it says in 36, between 16 and 23, therefore say to the house of Israel, this is what the sovereign Lord says. It is not for your sake, O house of Israel, that I am going to do these things, but for the sake of my holy name, which you have profaned among the nations where you have gone.
Right.
Go ahead.
So God says, I'm going to do it because I have a covenant. I made this covenant with Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. So actually, Ezekiel is following through with this covenant that was centuries before. Again, confirming it was the Jewish people. But God also said this: when he promised his covenant to Abraham, he also said in Deuteronomy, time of Moses, and Joshua, think of that, he says, you have the two mountains. And he goes, you'll be blessed. He's talking to Israel, the Jewish people. You will be blessed if you do these things. And it was just all these acts of obedience and the words that you say. I will bless you. I will keep you in the land. I'll bless your farms. You'll have babies. I'll bless your bushels. Everything will be fantastic. However, he said, if you do not obey my word, if you profane my name, if you come against me in any way, you're not keeping the law. This is what's going to happen to you. You will be cursed. And in the cursings, he actually says, I will disperse you to the corners of the earth. I'll disperse you everywhere. I will remove you from the land that I have planted you in. So that all that happened because they were not holding to what they were supposed to do. So God chose the Jewish people for the land, but in that, they also had that responsibility that Rabbi Barclay said. It was a responsibility ultimately to take the God of the Bible to the nations, to proclaim him wherever they were. But because they weren't faithful to do that, instead they were using, God even says, I'll teach you to make riches, teach you how to speak and so forth. they weren't using the gifts that God had given them to take his truth or deliver his truth to the people. They started using it for themselves. So God says, now you've got it wrong. You've been disobedient. They're dispersed. But again, going to Ezekiel 37, I will bring you back into the land. Now, one more thing. Yeah, go ahead.
Did God decide to cut off Israel? And
No. That's
okay.
But I'm
Right.
That's not our theology.
Okay. No.
Well,
I know it's not your theology. Let me ask the question. Did
okay.
God decide to cut off Israel on the basis that they, there were these many years? I mean, I look at the Old Testament. I was teaching at your church one time, Tom, and I was saying, look how the Old Testament is, how Israel, they turn from the Lord and they come back, and they turn from the Lord and they come back. And you had to get up and say, well, Bob's not teaching replacement theology. I remember that.
Well,
and I wasn't intending to say that. But it was just for us to see as a nation what happens when you turn from God.
Yeah.
But, Rabbi,
I want to interject on this because one of the challenges in studying Scripture is to study it in its actual language, because translation by definition is interpretation. So as an example, when we say you're profaning God's name, the understanding of that is that the four-letter name of Yod-Heh Vav-Heh is actually the human being itself. It corresponds, those letters actually look like a human being when they're put at a vertical level. And so there's a whole other teaching on that. It says that the Brit, the covenant between God and the people of Israel, between Abraham, between Jacob, the covenant that he makes is Le'olam Va'ed. It is forever. It is l'dor v'dor. It is from generation to generation. It doesn't go away. What does happen is when the relationship becomes split because the Hebrews or the Jews, as they ultimately become, step away from the agreement, then it's got to come back together. So it's not, when we look at the curses and you actually look at the Hebrew, it's not viewed as punishment, but as an understanding of karma, for lack of a better term. And look, if you're going to do this, everything's going to go good with you. And if you step away from this, it's bad. It's a loving father. There's no hate. Maimonides says, if you find hate or anger in the Torah, it is you, it is not the Torah. There's only love from God and joy. And it's like a loving father who says, you screw this up, bad things are going to happen. But the covenant is always there.
And it's kind of like the reference that we're talking about is to marriage. This analogy and in sickness and in health, right? I mean, the idea is to stay married, and that's really this covenant between, as we often say, the church and God, the church and Jesus. Here you're talking about Israel and God, this marital relationship that is not, God isn't going to divorce Israel.
Can I ask?
The Ten Commandments are actually a marriage contract, and it is all done. The first part of this is who I am, just like I would say to my wife, this is who I am. The next part of this is what I do. I brought you out of Egypt. The third line that is said that says there are no other gods before me is always translated that way. That's not what it says. What it says in the Hebrew is you shall have no other gods upon your face, because you can tell when someone's being unfaithful because you can look at their face. The entire Ten Commandments is a wedding contract, and so is the whole Torah. And it's when we betray that contract that there are problems. But it really is a marital relationship, and that's why, and it's a permanent one, forever and ever, generation to generation. So you might get separated, but you're never going to get divorced.
Let me let Netta step in here.
Can we define who Israel is? Because, especially growing up and being interested in Christianity and hearing that, these Israelis are God's chosen, and, looking at myself as a Christian, I think this question is more for Tom, as a Christian Palestinian. Who is Israel? Is it the current state and the government of Israel? Is it the original of the descendants of the 12 tribes? Like, can we define that term? I think that would help just in this discussion, me as a Palestinian understanding your theological view.
Sure. In the New Testament, the question comes up, who is Israel? And the way it's defined is those who are Israel who are faithful to the Lord, speaking specifically of the Jews when you think of the Jewish people. But here's where the church gets into some challenges, because most churches in America teach what's commonly referred to as replacement theology. But and so they teach, well, the Jews of today aren't really Israel, and the Christians of today are the real Israel. But let me just lay out a couple of passages, and I'll leave it at that, because the Jews are still ethnic Jews. You know, you can't separate that the way that you can't separate that ethnicity.
So
But in
Israel, the ethnically Jews.
Pardon me.
Are you saying that the ethnically Jewish are Israel?
Yeah, of course. Throughout when you look at, because even when you look at Ezekiel chapter 36, as God gathers Israel back to the land, he gathers them back at first in unbelief. It's at the end, and this gets into eschatology. So I'll avoid this part for a second.
We'll come back.
Let me just answer this. Okay, in Jeremiah chapter 33, this is an answer to the Jews and the current problem, I believe, that's been going on over in the land of Israel for a long time. In Jeremiah chapter 33, verse 24, God asks this question: have you not considered what the people are saying? The two families, there would be the northern tribes and the southern tribes. Think of Ephraim and Judah, Israel and Judah, two families, right? The two families, in other words, Israel, which the Lord has chosen, has he also cast them off? So the people are saying God has cast off Israel. He's cast off the Jews. Thus, he says this: they have despised my people, as if they should no more be a nation before them. God is saying, and then God makes the argument, this is what the people of the world are saying against the Jews, that they shouldn't be a nation anymore in that land. This is specific to the Jewish people and even the land. And then God says, I have not cast them off, as the sun and the moon and the stars. If you can stop that covenant, then my covenant with my people is over. And the way that I know this is still valid is because in the New Testament, in Romans chapter 11, the Apostle Paul asks the question, is God done with his people? He says, certainly not. And then at the end of Romans chapter 11, verse 25, the question is asked, or the Apostle Paul says this: I do not want you to be ignorant of these things, brethren, unless you be wise in your own opinion. In other words, don't be ignorant of this. Be wise about this. Blindness in part has happened to Israel. This is speaking of ethnic Jews. Blindness in part has happened to Israel, speaking spiritually, until the fullness of the Gentiles has come. Don't be ignorant, because if you think that God is done with Israel, if you believe in replacement theology, he says, you will be wise in your own opinion. He says, don't be ignorant of that, lest you be wise in your own opinion. Blindness in part has happened to Israel spiritually, of who the Messiah is, until the fullness of the Gentiles has come in. And then God will restore Israel. So what Jeremiah says in the Old Testament is confirmed also in the New Testament. So when I see that, it answers, look, the Jews in Israel, speaking ethnically, in the gathering right now, this has been happening in Israel right now, they're gathered in unbelief. I was in a
what do you mean by in unbelief?
In unbelief, not believing in Yeshua, still in the part of blindness and part has happened to Israel. I'll give you a real brief illustration. Then I promise I'll stop talking. I already said that 5 times. I'm a preacher. This is what I do. So I was in Jerusalem, and I was doing an interview with somebody who was a UN ambassador, Israeli UN ambassador. We're riding up in the elevator because we had the studio set up in the elevator in the Leonardo Plaza in one of the rooms. So we're riding up in the elevator. His name is Edinger, Yorm Edinger. And so we're riding up in the elevator, and he looks at me. He's a real tall man, like 6'5". He looks down at me. I'm kind of short, and he says, "This isn't going to be a religious interview, is it?" And I started laughing, and I said, "No." And then I asked him a few questions, because he told me he keeps the Shabbat and he celebrates the feast days. And it says, so you celebrate these religious things, but you're not a religious person. And he said, exactly. I said, okay. And that is how it is a lot of Israel. They're celebrating religion, but they are not yet believing. God again says, blindness in part has happened to Israel until the fullness of the Gentiles has come. So when I look at the Bible and I realize the gathering right now is the Yoram Ettingers. I have a lot of friends over in Israel, again, Jew, Gentile, and Christian. And I have both Christian Palestinian friends over there, Jewish friends who do not believe in the Messiah the way that I believe in the Messiah. But hey, that's all right. We're still friends, but I believe it is the fulfillment of Ezekiel 36, being gathered not in belief of Yeshua as being the Messiah yet.
And what is the fulfillment of the Gentiles?
Pardon me?
Please describe fulfillment of the Gentiles.
I don't think I could define that. I've heard other pastors define it who believe in dispensationalism, as Netta might point out. I don't necessarily define it the same way they would. But all I would say this, there appears by that passage alone and by also the book of Revelation and understanding the Old Testament, that there comes a time when the operation of God's work with the Gentile world to come to faith in him, it changes. And I don't understand exactly what that means, but Paul did write until the fullness of the Gentile comes, and then all Israel will be saved. And by the way, I want to say this, okay, and Ned, I think you would totally agree with me on this. When God says all Israel will be saved, he's talking about the remnant of Jews who come to faith in Yeshua. And we do know through the Old Testament, it becomes a very significantly large number. Also in the book of Revelation, we realize it's a significantly large number that come to faith in Yeshua in the future. But God, in my mind, God appears to close the door to the Gentiles or blind the spiritual eyes of the Gentiles and open up the spiritual eyes of the Jews. It's almost a flip-flop of what's taking place right now as far as Yeshua goes.
Okay, now I
Jesus, for everybody watching, that'd be Jesus.
Rabbi, if you can, now Rabbi is not a Messianic Jew,
right?
But he is a good
No. And I'm ordained Reformed, Conservative, and an Orthodox ordination, and I am a kosher Jew, and I'm considered a rabbinical scholar, and who also worked at a Jesuit university teaching theology. So
does that bug you what I just said?
Yeah. Well.
So, hey, let me say.
I think, Tom, that the answer that I give is the answer I give my friend Rob McCoy, and that I've given for years. First of all, if God accepts how we all pray, we should all accept how each other pray. Second of all, when the Messiah shows up, I'm going to say welcome, and you're going to say welcome back.
Dennis Prager says, "Have you been here before?"
We're going to accept that. So, one of the teachings of Mashiach, of the Messiah, and I really do believe that when the Messiah comes, may he come in our time. He'll be accepted by Christians of faith. He'll be accepted by Jews of faith. And we know that there are certainly a lot of prophecies and challenges when he does come about how he won't be accepted by people and how there'll be challenges. But I think, again, I go back to the Hebrew. In the book of, and there's also, from a biblical perspective, we need to understand that the book of Ezekiel and the book of Isaiah are very, very similar in a lot of ways. The difference is the way that it's phrased, because Ezekiel grew up in the diaspora as opposed to Babylon, as opposed to Isaiah actually saw the temple. So it's kind of like a country boy is Ezekiel, who's now seen the big city of the heavenly court. And he's like, wow, with all these things. And Isaiah says, yeah, it's nice. In Isaiah's prophecies, there are very clear things about it. And I try and teach this all the time, again, from the Hebrew, that when we are all going up to the mountain to pray, house of the Lord, it doesn't say Ben Abraham, the children of Abraham. It says Ben Adam, the children of Adam. The idea being that everyone, all paths, will be able to become unified in an acceptance of God. And that's a really specific piece when we talk about the chosenness of the Jewish people, that it's not that, oh, this is just, a Messiah will come, a Messianic age will come, and it's just for Jews, or it's just for Jews who accept this other guy, or whatever it may be. It will be for the children of the world. And that's so, so important from our perspective to understand that God's loving and everyone will be accepted because of God's love. And, the word blessing comes from the word bracha, which means to kneel. And we'll all accept God because we'll all humble ourselves, whether by choice or by force, but we'll all humble ourselves. And it's so important to I think, to understand that my friends who are Christian, my friends who are Catholic, my friends who are Muslim, my friends who are Buddhist, my friends who are Hindu, my friends who are all different denominations. Bob knows some of the different multicultural things that I do, that we'll all accept that Messiah and we'll all accept and pray together with God. I think that's really, really important. And that is the prophecies in the Hebrew for Isaiah, for Ezekiel, for all of the prophets. And another piece in that is that if you look at the last line of the book of Deuteronomy, book of Devarim, it talks about the wonders that God did for Pharaoh, in front of Pharaoh and his courtiers, his servants, his court, and all the people, and all the land. And the word is very specific. It doesn't mean the land like everyone on the land. It means the land itself of Israel has a consciousness. It has a divine spirit woven into the very fabric of the land itself. And it has its own personality. And that's something also to remember. That's what the text actually says in the Hebrew. And so we need to honor that when we say Israel, Netta, when you say, what is Israel? It's so large and so vague in so many ways. People obviously who have accepted Judaism, the people who were ethnically Jewish, people who live by the commandments. It's the land itself. And it's also the definition of the word Israel, which literally means he who wrestles with God. That's literally what the name means. And it's not wrestling like fighting, but wrestling like intimacy. And that includes Christians and other people too.
So we have
I don't have a problem per se with the theology, Tom. I don't have that problem with it. It's just, it is, to me, it's much more than that, because I really do believe that God will accept everyone.
So Rabbis has a much broader view of who Israel is than Tom, you do, and I do. I think that's that's fair to say, right? Right, Tom?
Yeah, I would say you're accurate.
Yeah, it's an interesting thing. There's a teaching. Jacob changes his name. Jacob's name is changed to Israel, right? We all know that. But then certain times we're referred to Bnei Yisrael, and other times Bnei Yaakov, the children of Israel, the children of Jacob. Well, there's a reason. There's a teaching every time that it's about Bnei Yaakov, that it's about the Yaakov archetype, the Jacob archetype, as opposed to Israel, which is the close, this kind of archetype. And Jacob kind of wanders around things. So there's consciousness, because I really do believe every word of Torah is perfect and written by God. I actually believe that. So not written by men, inspired by God, but the Torah is actually written by God.
Let me jump to the next part of this question, unless, Tom, you have something you want to interject.
He just mentioned you have Jacob and Israel. We have also in the New Testament, Peter and Simon. When Jesus referred to Peter as Simon, he was referring to the old Simon, the old way he was. I just thought it was kind of humorous. You have it both in the Old Testament and New Testament.
Name changes. Name changes are important. Names are very important.
Well, I want to get to Ezekiel 36 in a little more direction and talk a little bit about the eschatological perspective. Eschatology. And
all right, then Bob, I'm going to ask to be excused for one moment then while I get a Tanakh so I can actually look at it with you. That's okay.
Go ahead. So, so in Ezekiel 36, what I love about it so much is that to me, I think it is prophecy being fulfilled in front of our eyes. It's prophecy that began roughly in 1948 when Israel became a nation again. And we have seen this incredible gathering of ethnic Jews being brought back to Israel. And in Ezekiel 34, in verse 11, the prophecy is, the sovereign Lord says, speaking of his flock, of his sheep, He says, I will rescue them from all the places where they were scattered on a day of clouds and darkness. I will bring them out from the nations and gather them from the countries, and I will bring them into their own land. Now, Rabbi Barclay, I've talked to you about Ezekiel 34, 5, 6, this subject in the past, and you have said, well, I don't know that section of scripture necessarily applies to what's happening today, and that it would have happened prior to the destruction of the temple in AD 70, when Jews came after they were taken to Babylon and they were enslaved, and they came back to the land. And you referenced that, or we've talked about that. However, when I read this scripture and I read it, you read it all kind of in context. There's numerous portions of this scripture that indicate to me that this scripture is not necessarily applicable to what happened pre destruction of the temple in AD 70, right? But it was, but it's what's happening today because of the description.
So Bob, I'm going to ask you, two things, but I'm going to ask you to repeat your translation. But before that, understand the modern state of Israel really exists because of a man named Rabbi Abraham Isaac Kook. Because there were two groups that came in, people who were very observant Orthodox, who were going there because of religious purposes, and then Zionists who were basically socialist and secularists. And Kook said to them, the first amazing being, mystic, a phenomenal rabbi, and he said to the people who were observant, look, you're the spirit, but they're the body, and your spirit doesn't happen without a body to work in. And he said to the people who were the Zionists, who were secular, you are the body, but you are hollow and empty without these. So modern state of Israel is a very weird combination of a religious and a secular state at the same time. But I'm going to ask if you could repeat, I don't know what translation you're reading, but if you could repeat because you're looking at 34:11, correct?
Yeah.
Could you repeat what yours says?
So, for this is what the sovereign Lord says, I myself will search for my sheep and look after them. As a shepherd looks after his scattered flock when he is with them, so I will look after my sheep. I will rescue them from all the places where they were scattered on a day of clouds and darkness. I will bring them out from the nations and gather them from the countries, and I will bring them into their own land. And this is consistent with what is described further in Ezekiel 36.
So taking this one on its face and looking at the Hebrew, he doesn't bring anybody anywhere. That's not what the text actually says. What it says is that he will tend them. And there's a difference. He talks about that it's a different verb. So here in this English translation, which is straight from the Hebrew, it's Art Scroll. I will tend to my sheep and rescue them from all the places where they're scattered on the day of cloud and darkness. It's a slightly different. It's not that he will bring them out. And for us, there's a difference in that theology, because he brought us out of Egypt. That's literally the term that is used, with an outstretched arm and a strong arm and outstretched hand. That is, he brought us out of Egypt. Conversely, here he is saying he will tend us, and there is a difference between guiding and bringing out. So I would
look at 36, Ezekiel 36.
Are you trying to change his mind?
Verse 24.
Am I trying to change? No, I'm just giving.
How about this?
No. I'm not saying it's right or not. I'm just saying.
It sounds like Rabbi Barclay's view of end times is similar to mine. Is that right?
Yeah, I was going to say.
I'm not giving a view. I'm just saying the text. I'm not giving a view. I'm just doing the honest translation of it.
Yes,
Bob, where were you? 36 what?
Barclay, you are giving an honest translation, and I appreciate that.
It sounds like. Yeah,
Bob,
I'll comment after you're done.
36 what? I'm sorry.
Okay, Tom, and I'm probably gonna need your help to jump in here.
No, I'll wait. I'll wait. It sounds like Rabbi Barclay is saying the Jews don't have any right to the land right now.
Yeah, that's what it sounds like. But let's get to.
Although there's that theology, by the way, in some Orthodox circles.
Yes, there is.
Okay.
but I wouldn't go there. But okay, what's the 36 that you're looking at?
I feel like
And we don't, and by the way, you got to remember something. There's a difference in our understanding and interpretation and how we look at Torah and how we look at the rest of the Bible. There's a radically different understanding and level of halacha of law, because Torah is written by God, the rest of the Bible is written by men, hopefully inspired by God. So there's a radical difference in those two things. But so Ezekiel doesn't have the same as Deuteronomy.
You're right. That is a big difference.
That's a big difference. All right, so where are we talking 36 what? I love looking at that.
Ezekiel 36, starting at verse 24. Let me read this. For I will take you out of the nations. I will gather you from all the countries and bring you back into your own land. I will sprinkle clean water on you, and you will be clean. I will cleanse you from all your impurities and all your idols. I will give you a new heart and put a new spirit in you. I will remove you from your heart of stone and give you a heart of flesh. And I will put my spirit in you and move you to follow my decrees and be careful to keep my laws. This is important. You will live in the land I gave your forefathers. You will be my people, and I will be your God.
Close enough. Close. I mean, not great translation, but close enough.
So Bob, you're saying this is happening right now with the ethnically Jewish population in Israel?
Absolutely. I read Ezekiel 34 through 36 and see these things happening where it speaks of God bringing the Jews back. Now, they don't have the Spirit working in them at this point in time, I don't think, because they're not, and that's one important thing, like the government of Israel, I don't think that the government of Israel is necessarily sitting here honoring God in all that they do, especially with a lot of the immoral things that we're seeing going on in Israel. So it's not the government that I feel is God's chosen. It's the people. It's the ethnicity that God has chosen, brought back to Israel. Tom, can you agree or want to add to that?
Well, actually, I would just add to it what you opened up the whole conversation with was Ezekiel 36. Whereas they have profaned my name wherever I have scattered them, I will bring them back because of my name, because of my covenant, regardless. So I think it's answered there. Two other things I want to bring up too. When you read it in context, you follow through to chapter 34, 35, 36, 37, 38. God tells us when you get to 38, this is in the latter times. The other thing, Isaiah chapter 11 says, I'm going to bring you back a second time. That's never happened before until what's happening now. So when I look at these, I don't think it's just a coincidence. Either these are not God's people that are over in the land right now, or these are. It's one or the other. And God's word is being fulfilled the way that you and I look at it, Bob. Something else also, which is really kind of interesting as we watch, anti-Semitism has always been a problem with the Jewish people. Always, since their beginning. In the book of Deuteronomy, in the blessings and cursings passage, when God says, I will disperse you to the four corners of the earth, wherever you go, you will become a byword. You look up the word byword in the Hebrew for what is used there, and it's pretty easy to come to the conclusion you're going to become, it's an anti-Semitic world where you're going to go into. So when I look at all of these different things, when I look at the Old Testament and the New Testament, and I put them together, it's hard for me to not see these things are not just a coincidence, especially when I look at the nation of Israel and the Jewish people, ethnically the Jewish people. It can't just be a coincidence. I had a friend who followed a teacher named Hank Hanegraaff for years, and he knew him. I said, well, ask him, how are all these things, there are several different things, all surrounding the Jewish people, and I pointed them out in the Bible. And I said, how could all these things be a coincidence if what you're saying, Bob, is not the correct interpretation? And I never got an answer on that because there's just too many coincidences that happen to line up with not just Ezekiel, but a lot of the prophets.
Look, and there's a great saying, coincidence is God's way of staying anonymous.
You know, well, yeah, then you look at Book Esther, right? But still, and that brings me to another point, because there are Jews who say that the Jews in Israel do not have a right to the land. I hear it. Some of the
so let me explain where that comes from. Okay. And that's not the majority of us. The majority of us believe that we do have a right to land, but we believe that we should be living in it, and it should be existing right now. There were certain fights in the formation of Israel where there were people who felt that there should be no nation of Israel until the Messiah comes and rebuilds the temple. And that Ben Gurion was surrounded by a bunch of thugs who were not observant, and that's not how Israel should be created. And there are still different Orthodox sects who believe that, we were under the impression the Messiah is going to rebuild the temple, and that's how we're all going to come back to Israel. The majority of Judaism, we believe very differently, because we accept the world that God creates. And since God did bring us back, it means now is the time we were supposed to be back. And then you have other prophecies. Are you guys familiar, Bob? Are there any of the three of you familiar with the foxes? What just happened last year with the foxes?
Okay. Yeah, I watched those
Okay.
videos.
This is amazing. There's a story after the destruction of the temple with Rabbi Akiva, who was the great sage of the Talmud of his time, and was the spiritual leader of the Barclay rebellion. And he's with three other rabbis, and they're walking through the ruins of what was the temple, and they see foxes. And the other three rabbis start crying. He starts laughing. And the reason they say, "What are you laughing about? There are foxes going through our temple." He goes, "Yes, but the prophecy was that there will be foxes going through the temple, and then we will be gathered back together, and the temple will be rebuilt. So if part one of the prophecy is true, part two of the prophecy will also be true." Last year, and you can YouTube it, there is a video. There were foxes wandering through the walls of the temple and on the Temple Mount. And for many of us, we looked at that and said, okay, the time's here. At the same time, so it's really important. That was a really big piece for a lot of us. And it brought tears to my eyes when I saw it. And for a lot of us, it's a really, really big piece. At the same time, there's a Jewish tradition that as long as we try to say the Messiah is coming on this date or at this time, as long as we do that, the Messiah will delay. That the Messiah will come when we're no longer concerned about when is the Messiah coming, and more concerned about how are we treating each other. That's when the Messiah will come. And that as long as we focus, there's this wonderful Jewish tradition, Rabbi goes into it. It's based on the book of Daniel, but the idea that we will, as long as we're focused on Messiah's coming next week, next year, next decade, because here are these quote unquote signs, Messiah's not going to come. But the moment that we all stop that and instead focus on faith and on acting righteously with each other, and realizing that at that same time, there's going to be more hatred against all people of faith, that there's going to be this radical world of hatred against anyone who is on God's side, so to speak, and we still stay with it. That's when the Messiah will come. Not every time we say, "Oh, he's coming next year," it actually forces him to delay a little bit, which I think is a really interesting tradition that goes back well over 2,000 years.
So are you saying the Messiah won't come till we get along?
Well,
I don't see that ever happening.
Well, or there's a lot of Messiah traditions. One is the Messiah will come when every Jewish male has wrapped tefillin, are the phylacteries around our arm, or when every Jewish female has lit Sabbath candles, or when no Jewish male has wrapped tefillin, or no Jewish female has lit candles. Yeah, and there's a tradition that the Messiah will come when he's no longer needed. There's also a tradition that, look, I said 2 Jews, 3 opinions, 4 synagogues, 5 rabbis. So it's, there's also the opinion that the Messiah will come as there's this split, where there's the split of people of faith and people who are not of faith, and that it's going to be extremely, extremely dark. These people are really going to attack the people of faith.
Are these the birth pains that you and I spoke of not long ago?
It's part of that concept. And Rabbi Nachman, who's the great mystic of the 19th century, the head of the Breslov Hasidim, founder of the Breslov Hasidim, really does a fair amount of commentary onto this. The idea is that in part of those birth pangs are when it's going to be really hard for people of faith to stay faithful. It's just going to be really difficult. And the fact that we have a prophecy that it's going to be real difficult doesn't change that it's going to be difficult and it's going to be hard, and all the more reason that we need to do it. We're taught that as those birth pangs happen, that someone who is just kosher will be considered on the same level as the Baal Shem Tov, who was one of the greatest mystics of Judaism. It'll be that split. And we see that worldwide. We see that interfaith, and we certainly see that in the Jewish world.
I think
Bob, are you aware of the rabbinic student thing that just happened last week?
I don't know.
Tom, do you know about this?
Which
So last week, this is an example of that kind of pain. Last week,
up in
last week, close to 100
Yeah.
rabbinic students wrote a public letter condemning Israel and promoting Palestine and Hamas. And their deans remained silent as opposed to expelling them. And some of them are graduating this weekend. That's an example where you're even having quote unquote spiritual leaders in the Jewish world who are, I don't know how you call a rabbi who condemns Israel. Those two don't mix. There's some things that are just, if the guy wants to eat pork, I wouldn't stop him from being a rabbi. I just say he's a shmendra. But if you to condemn Israel, and their deans were silent because the tuition fees are so high. And I think that's more of a symptom in the Jewish world of these birth pangs that you're talking about.
So one of the things I think that really unite yourself and I, Rabbi Barclay, and all four of us is, we do see a time of the end when things become more difficult for particularly Christians and Jews. And we are seeing those times. And so, Pastor Tom, would you like to comment on any of that
Sure.
Rabbi Barclay said, and then I want to jump kind of to our last question.
Yeah, what I have to say is not very pleasant, so I'll keep it real short. Well, two things. First of all, when Rabbi Barclay mentioned traditions and this tradition and that tradition, I just was reminded of Fiddler on the Roof, because that was the big brother traditions. And but also, I do base what I believe just on the Bible. And so when I look at birth pains, you have both the Apostle Paul specifically mentions birth pains in 1 Thessalonians chapter 5. And then Jesus in the Olivet Discourse, Matthew 24, he said, these are the beginning of sorrows. That's a phrase, a Hebrew phrase for birth pains. So all of the events that we see taking place, the sorrows will increase like birth pains upon a pregnant woman. The closer and closer we get to what I would say the second coming of the Messiah, these things will increase in frequency and intensity. Netta, you recently had a baby. I've never had one. You know exactly what that's like. I can only go with a woman who can describe it. Much more frequent, much more intense, painful. So that is how the Bible describes these events taking place. So it's not a surprise to watch what is happening right now in the world. And things are happening on a global scale now. Anti-Semitism now is on a global scale. You start looking at things that are taking place. It's not just that, lots of them, but they're increasing. It's much more painful. People don't like to hear me say that, but at the same time, this is what the Bible does warn us of. Even as Rabbi Barclay said, the prophet, even though it's a prophecy, it doesn't really make us feel any better, but these things are still prophetic. It will go this direction, unfortunately.
And Tom, when you're talking about anti-Semitism being increased, it is worse than it has ever been in my lifetime, certainly. And it is so subversive. And I put this out every time I speak, every time I write. I really think this is an important thing we all need to put out. The most powerful organization in the last few years that has become so powerful in the last years is BLM. BLM is in its charter, and Bob, I've sent you the links. It is for the destruction of Israel. Calls it very specifically, this is its charter. Not only BDS, it's an apartheid nation, needs to be destroyed. All these things are in the BLM charter. And all these nice people who are saying, oh, well, we're just supporting equality. No, when you're supporting BLM, all lives matter. Racism is a spiritual issue. That's why Dr. King and Rabbi Heschel were such good friends. And when you make the comment that oh, we're trying to take care of this. And no, BLM is a hate-filled, hateful, vitriolic organization that I think is so anti-Semitic and is demonstrating, Tom, it's making that split faster too, in terms of
it is.
it's
Yep.
really pushing that split.
Yep.
And the succumbing to it, the seductiveness of it. This is where power is. This is where money is. So we're going to support BLM, or we're scared to say anything against BLM. That's what is going to separate the wheat from the chaff. And as hard as it is to be a faith, we have to stand in that place and say, this isn't okay. You don't get to send vans that look like Palestinian flags through Jewish neighborhoods saying we're going to kill the Jews and rape your daughters.
Mm-hmm. And this is what
that's what goes on.
This is what actually happened there in La Cienega in LA last week, right? Something to that effect?
La Cienega, okay, at a place called Sushi Fumi, and I'm extremely familiar with this because it's one of my congregants that was there and was beat up. I'm officiating his wedding, God willing, in 2 weeks from tomorrow in Cabo San Lucas. And a couple of guys come out, they have the scarves on like they're Palestinian, and they say, who here is Jewish? Most of them run in, and 4 young Persian guys say, we are, why? And 20 guys dressed like that come and beat the daylights out of them, where they all had to go to the hospital. The police have done nothing. They have found one person who's a suspect, and they're saying maybe it's a hate crime. Maybe. And they found one person. This has gone on. We now have armed security at all of our services, at all of our gatherings. And this is, there was just a demonstration, Westlake, nice, so upper class suburb of Los Angeles, right? Very nice. 200 kids, I say kids, 20s and 30s, with big Palestinian flags on 3 street corners. And not one of them has a Middle Eastern background, unless they suddenly started making blonde, blue-eyed Middle Eastern people that I don't know about, okay? They're all, standing there demonstrating. And they're not demonstrating. They're trying to start a riot as they have people filming their own stuff, as they're on megaphones saying, F the Jews, F Israel, we're going to kill your daughters. I stayed in my car. I wanted to hear what they were saying. And these were paid protesters, let's be clear. And they were agent provocateurs. And this is going on all over the country. It's being ignored by the government because of people like Tlaib and Omar. May their memory be erased and blotted out. And it's going on all over, where they are being funded through Movement for Black Lives and Black Lives Matter. And we need to be honest about it, and we need to call them out. That's simple.
Rabbi,
so I'm sorry for getting very passionate about it, but this is one of my kids just got beat up right before his wedding. Well, not my physical kid, but one of my congregants.
And we here, I know unanimously say we're incredibly sympathetic to you and the plight, and so I want to jump a bit to the other side now. Now, Netta, from a Palestinian perspective, this it hits home. You have family there, you have family in Israel, and really, how should we, from a biblical perspective, be looking at the Palestinian people? There's some that question, well, is there a specific ethnicity of Palestinians? Is there, et cetera, et cetera? I'm interested to know from your perspective, and, obviously from the others here too, what should we be thinking about the Palestinians versus Hamas versus Hezbollah?
Well, I think it's a good place to start by not grouping terrorists and those that Rabbi Barclay was describing, the rioters and those who wish death upon Jews and Israel, with Palestinian people who have no association with that, who I know just my family, myself, and I've been to the West Bank and Palestine. We're very loving, simple people that really live off of the land that we have. which, the farming, and it really, they just want to live in peace. And a lot of Palestinians, myself included, when I do see airstrikes that target children, not target, but when there are casualties, I don't look at it as one side against the other. My heart breaks for those children, whether they're Jewish children or Palestinian children. And to me, as a Christian, condemning certain actions, let's say, a government funded abortion in Israel, or if there's an instance where an airstrike is unwarranted, if I condemn that, that's not me being anti-Semitic. That's not me being anti-Christian. That is just, like you were saying, Rabbi, of being focused on loving each other and on, I don't look at it as Jew, Muslim, or Christian. It's really like humanity and what I'm seeing. And there is truth to the suffering of the Palestinian people. It's not just that it's all inflicted by Hamas. It just, in a war in general, there will be casualties, and we don't look at what is it justified, is it defense. It's look at it through human eyes with it is destruction of people's homes and livelihood, whether the perpetrator is Hamas, because even that, when I think of free Palestine, I think of free Palestine from Hamas, free Palestine from Hezbollah, and from these terrorist organizations. And so there is a genuine justification for waving that Palestinian flag, because my parents were born in Palestine, and that to me is my blood. But I do understand the association, just like BLM and the organization is corrupt and horrible. But for someone to stand up against racism, as apart from that organization and every disgusting thing that they stand for, they're two separate things. So, and one of the things that hurts me as a Christian is when I hear pastors and other Christians frame the conflict as Palestine versus Israel. And Palestine is defined as Hamas and Hezbollah and terrorist. And, the only reason that Palestinians are suffering is because Hamas uses them as human shields. Can we recognize that most of the deaths have come from Israeli airstrikes, and not just blame it on the Hamas people in general? So to look at it with more of a human perspective, because it just seems to me that it's pitting Hamas against Israel, and you have to either support Israel as a Christian, and by support Israel, it's support the current government of Israel, and that's what we fund, and that's what funds abortion in Israel. And so it's just more nuanced, and also looking at when we say that, just going with the theology of Israel as, God wants to restore that to the ethnically Jews. Well, what land is that? Is it the Gaza Strip? Is it all of the West Bank? At what point do we draw a line with letting a group live peaceably and not encroaching on that land, and fulfilling, giving whether it's biblically or just from a place of morality, to have that Jewish state. There's many things that you can support with that, whether, and even like national defense, and as an American and wanting America to have a position in Israel. So all that to say is, it's not one or the other and pitting these two sides against each other. And it's not that they're all going to live in peace, because, the peace in the Middle East, it's not that simple either. But we do, as Christians particularly, need to acknowledge the Palestinian people that are victims in this.
I think one of the things,
Bob, I need to, because there's some things that you're right on the one hand, not without question. And it's why the top selling beer to IDF soldiers is a Palestinian beer. Because the soldiers recognize that it's not the people. And when the people are economically secure, they don't want to be doing this craziness. You know about the human shields. You know about the different people who've talked about how, and I quote, women and children make the best human shields. But I'm going to send you this video, Bob, and you should share with Ned and Tom. We talk about they did an airstrike. and they did an airstrike on a hospital, the best hospital in Gaza, actually. And
Israel did not strike, you're saying.
Israel did the airstrike on what is the top medical facility in Gaza. And by the way, the biblical definition of Israel includes the West Bank. Okay, it does include that. But so that's why I'm keeping it out of the biblical definition. But that hospital was a munitions dump for Hamas, number one. Number two, 3 hours beforehand, they made sure everyone knew, please evacuate because we're going to bomb this building. No time in the history of the world has anyone given notice we're going to attack this place to try and make sure civilian casualties are limited. The same with the all-boys school, the same with the building that the media was in. That's also where Hamas's organizational leadership was. And everyone knew it, and all of the AP knew it, and all of the press knew it. They all knew that that's where Hamas was headquartered. And they all had 3 hours notice saying, we're going to bomb this because we're not going to let ourselves we're not going to commit suicide. And so we're going to take out these rockets, and we're going to take out these organizations, and we're giving you notice, please get out, because we don't want Palestinian people. So the using of human shields, which was so atrocious, is mirrored with the using of places that should never be used, God forbid, to hold rockets, etc. The other thing is, apparently from the last statistic I read, approximately a quarter to a third of the people who died in Gaza in this last 2-week conflict were because of misfired Gaza rockets, which I read that in Times of Israel, I think it was, or Haaretz. And I think that's a fascinating statement too. But we need to support the people. Remember, any prophecy made to Abraham is also for Isaac and for Ishmael. Okay, they're brothers. That means the Palestinians are my cousin. The problem isn't the Palestinian people. The problem is that Hamas is doing what they're doing, and they get away with it, that they're supported by the governments, including the US government. They're supported by Iran. The problem is that they want hate. Golda Meir said it beautifully. The day that, if the Arabs put down their weapons today, she said, tomorrow we would have peace. If we put down our weapons today, God forbid, there'd be no Israel tomorrow. Until the Palestinian people, who like all people are good people, get rid of Hamas, this is going to keep going on. And that's a reality.
You know, one of the things that I that seems so shocking to me is, I understand, you know, they're going in and they've bombed, you know, I hear they're trying to do precision strikes and that sort of thing. Yet at the same time, there are going to be casualties. But Hamas has sent off 4,000 plus, I think was the last number I heard, rockets almost randomly into Israel. And they would hit, who knows where they would hit if it wasn't for the shield.
Yeah, and it's also another piece to add to that, Bob, is I know some people who were doing this. In fact, I will tell you the story of a friend and a congregant who, in the second Intifada, he with his partner had to go to each building to clear it out one at a time to make sure civilians were not there. And the man has huge PTSD because what came out was a Hamas with a child in front of him who was also holding a gun. And this congregant froze. I mean, he'd killed people before. It's a horrible thing. But how do you shoot a child? And they killed his partner. And so he immediately reacted. And he has nightmares. He drinks himself to sleep every night. Golda Meir again said it beautifully. We can forgive them for what they've done to us. We cannot forgive them for what they have made us do to them. This man has nightmares every night. He sees that child's face. What was he supposed to do? That's the horror. And when the Palestinian people remove that horror, that head of a snake, then it becomes the land of Abraham's descendants, which are Isaac and Ishmael. Ishmael is also the son and also entitled to that prophecy.
Tom, what do you think?
The whole thing is just horrible. And I want to say this, Ned, I don't know if you've listened to me very much, but some of what you shared are things that I say, but almost every time I talk about Israel and what does go on over there, I will say, I will stand up for the Palestinian people, because I realize they're real people too. I don't, I do understand that. And I try to help people understand, here's why I support Israel. I don't support Israel because of abortion or any of these things. I will go back to Ezekiel chapter 36 with people, and even in my own mind, and understand it's not because they're more lovable, but God has made a covenant with Israel, has also made a covenant with me through his son. And if God's a covenant breaker, then how can I trust him for the salvation he's given me? So in the whole package, I get that there are real Palestinian people. I also understand the dynamics of the war that Hamas does, that Hezbollah does to the north. It is absolutely atrocious. What kind of people does that to their own people and actually says they love them? That's what Hamas does. We love you. We're gonna put these missile silos in a hospital. We're gonna put them in a school. This is horrible. Hamas does not love the Palestinian people, and it's absolutely horrific. When it comes to the land of Israel, there's 1.9 million Muslims that live in the land of Israel, and we don't hear that dynamic coming from the Western media. We don't look at the map, and you look at the size of Israel in comparison with all of the Muslim nations around Israel. It's unbelievable to hear Iran say, from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. Listen, in the term West Bank, it's really Judea and Samaria, but you won't hear those names used. I believe that Israel would love to live peaceably. The times I've been over to Israel again, which is many times, I've met so many Palestinians that are working in Israeli businesses over there, and I've become friends with them. And again, as I said earlier, I don't know anybody over there that actually likes the violence, and it's horrible. As I think about it here at home, I don't have family over there as you do. I have friends over there, and on all the different sides, and it just breaks my heart to see what happens. This is war, and I am thankful that the Lord is coming and he's going to fix this mess. I pray for the peace of Jerusalem. Psalm 122 verse 6, I realize that the peace of Jerusalem will not come. That genuine peace won't come until the Messiah comes. That's the way I see that. But in the meantime, we strive forward. And in my support of Israel, I'm not discounting the Palestinian people or any other people for that matter. For God saves people from every tribe, nation, tongue, and people, from every single place there are. Jew and everybody else, Gentile. God will save people from everywhere. And it is awful, but I agree with the rabbi. And God has given Israel a lot more land than just from the river to the sea, by the way. But that's a whole nother subject that's not in play right now. But I look at it as the rabbi does, and I see it is Hamas, it's Iran, it is Hezbollah, and there are some very bad people over there. And it's because of these bad people that has driven things like the Abraham Accord to these other Arab nations that are going, we don't want this. We don't like this that's happening over there with Gaza and these terrorist organizations. They don't want it either. They realize what's really happening. And you know, it's awful. My heart breaks for you, Netta. I think you're absolutely wonderful. And and may God bless you and your family. And who knows, maybe one of the times when I'm over there in Jerusalem, I'll be able to meet some of your family, who knows. But it's horrible to see it happening all around. But there are all these rockets. I think of it, what would you do take a neighborhood in America that's tract homes. All of a sudden rockets start being launched. What do? You don't, it's a real thing, but these are very wicked people that would put their own people in harm's way and say, we love you, but guess what? We're going to put a rocket launcher here in your library or wherever it is. Just, in fact, I believe that's against international law to put missile silos in places like that too, but that's a whole nother debate.
Or when you have a leader of Hamas publicly enjoining people to go buy a 5 shekel knife and cut every Jew's head off ear to ear.
Where in this equation though is the wrongdoing on behalf of Israel and the IDF? Because it's often framed as, you know, there's these Hamas agents doing all these terrible things, but the videos that get sent to me that I see from my family, from there is generally, it's one-sided, of course, but it is a soldier that's abusing a child or arresting a little kid, or a family's you know, just in going to the West Bank and hearing these stories of people who, you know, there's a little boy that he had an eye patch, and I asked what was wrong, and it was that he was shot by an Israeli soldier and he wasn't particularly doing anything wrong. So I'm just saying that we're dealing with human nature and sinful humans on both sides. I understand Hamas is horrendous and terrible and they're illegitimate. And but at the same time, we do need to acknowledge that there are issues with how the IDF, certain people within the IDF, have treated Palestinians. There's even like videos online of soldiers, Israeli soldiers, just saying despicable things about Palestinians. And just as Rabbi, you were saying that you heard Palestinians say death to the Jews, or these people who were protesting who weren't Palestinians say things like that. There are people on the Israeli side doing the exact same thing to Palestinians. And I'm bombarded with that information all the time.
But not much of the information that you're receiving. There's a famous picture, a famous photograph a few years back, and it was some Palestinian children throwing rocks at Israeli soldiers. I don't know if you remember that. It was an award-winning photo. But it was only half the photo, and was released what the whole photo was. That wasn't the photo. It was all a setup for the media.
Yeah.
And if you're going to put a gun in a child's hand and say, kill that Israeli, and that's what children are being raised to do. That is what Hamas is raising children to do. That's what is happening there. Then whatever they need to do in their self-defense, they're not going to commit suicide. There is, you know, in the Israeli Defense Force, it was true, I believe it still is, that there was an overriding rule that if you were asked to do something by a commander that was against ethics, and the phrase was at the time, if you see a black flag before your eyes, you were not only permitted to not do it, you were commanded to not do it and to report your superior. Nowhere in the history of the planet, there are always civilian casualties, and it is sad. It's sad wherever it is. Nowhere in the history of the planet has there been a nation or a group who has declared war on another nation. Let's be clear, every one of these wars has been started by Hamas, by Hezbollah, etc. Not one has been started by Israel. Not one since 1948. And without exception. And Group A says, we want to kill Group B. And yet Group B says, well, we're going to tell you when we're going to attack you and where, to try and get as many civilians out as you can. That is unique in the history of the world. It is why the Israel Defense Force is called just that, Defense Force. It's not a proactive army. And their prayers are to always shut it down so that it's not needed. It's not going to happen, though, until the evil of Hamas and Hezbollah, until they're gone.
Let me I think to try to wrap up here, and I would like to say,
Yeah, this was supposed to be an hour, Bob. What happened?
I know this was awesome. I really appreciate it. That I know from my perspective as an evangelical who believes the Jews are God's chosen, and that was one of the first things I think I told you, Rabbi, why I wanted to represent you.
I thought it was because you just liked me.
No, just because
It's
I think
like
you're God.
reverse racism. He doesn't care. He just because you're Jewish, he'll do whatever you want.
Just because you're
Take advantage of it. Free legal services.
Yeah, exactly. Free.
Free?
Like you.
Free legal for me too?
No,
Wow.
no,
You're not.
You're not,
Oh.
you're not God's original chosen. So
Oh.
you can talk.
If I,
Tom,
you know,
you can do a conversion.
I have a great grandmother that's Ashkenazi, I have a great 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 grandmother that's Sephardic. My friend said you need to tell the rabbis.
So wait, is it on your mother's side or father's side?
Both of them are on my mother's side.
You're
Okay.
Jewish, pal.
Yeah, that's what one of my other friends told me.
Here's what I wanted to say. In reality, I really love you, Rabbi Barclay, but just because I believe you're God's chosen doesn't mean that I like you. Doesn't mean I like what you do. I agree with you with everything. With you, that I do love you, and
Okay, I feel better.
and we see so many things similarly. But similarly, I think with with Tom and I, we look at God's chosen people. We don't look at God's chosen government. Just because we believe that the Jewish ethnicity is God's chosen doesn't mean that I think that whoever the president or prime minister is necessarily God's chosen to be in that position. Or does that necessarily mean that just because a Jew in the IDF may be engaged in some sort of abuse of a Palestinian, that means, oh, I'm on the side of that Jew because he's Jew? That's not it. It's really the fact that the Bible's, God wants he's going to bring glory to himself through this people. And I wish, I often think, I wish I was Jewish, but I'm not. I actually have a little Ashkenazi as well, but that little teeny percent. Anyways,
I'm probably more Jewish than both of you.
You
Probably.
Actually,
You probably
Bob,
are.
your Jewish percentage comes out, and that I get to make you feel guilty once in a while. That's
yeah,
all.
exactly. Let's wrap this up, guys. Thank you. Do you have like a 15-second comment you want to make?
I do actually. Okay, Tom, go.
No, I don't. Thank you very much for the time. It was great to meet you, Rabbi. Good to see you again, Netta. And again, thank you, Bob. You said it perfectly. Being God's chosen people is not the same as God's chosen government, and it's understanding that's a great way of saying it. Thank you. You just gave me a new phrase, by the way.
Okay. Every time you use it, it's money.
I don't even get paid for what I do. What do you mean?
Well, how am I supposed to get paid for what I do? Rabbi Barclay, you want to?
There's a story I want to share, just because it's really beautiful, even though it never happened. I mean, it happened.
15 seconds. Remember, go ahead.
There was a man named Rabbi Shlomo Karl. I'll talk very quickly. There was a man named Rabbi Shlomo Karlbach of blessed memory. He died a few years back. He was an Orthodox rabbi, a great teacher, and actually he was a great musician as well, and had a synagogue up in Haight-Ashbury in San Francisco, and was really this amazing being. And it was either after the 67 or the Yom Kippur War. He actually went to the Israeli government, and this ties into what you say, that the government is not necessarily what is chosen, because if they had been, they would have said yes to this. He said, you have the best army for war in the world. He goes, you need an army for peace. I want to bring 100 of my musician hippie friends. I want to bring them to Israel, and I want to go around to all of the Arab nations, all of the Arab homes, and say, we want to play music at your joyous events for free. You need an army for peace. Because I guarantee you, he said, if you let us sing at their joyous, at their weddings, you will make brothers and sisters, and we will have peace. And it's a beautiful concept. Didn't happen because of what you're saying. The government, if they were truly a holy government at that time, I'm not saying they didn't have holy intentions or anything else, but if they'd seen it from another perspective, they would have said, absolutely, we need an army for peace now. And I believe we do need that army for peace. That's why I'm so committed to interfaith dialogue. And so I thank you guys. And it's great to meet you virtually, Tom, and Netta. I love you, and Bob. You a lot more than Bob, but
Netta, do you have anything you want to close with?
Just for those people of faith to remember Palestinians in their prayers. And I think there's a missed opportunity for evangelical Christians with the Palestinians, that sometimes they're overseen and they're not ministered to, and it's just a missed opportunity. And also, when someone like me is in the congregation and it's just all one-sided of pray for Israel, and against terrorists, and Palestinians is used interchangeably with Hamas. That's a shame, really. So for those Christians and people of faith that are watching, to please pray for my people. And that's all.
Amen.
Thank you, Netta. That was a good reminder for me. Appreciate that.
Thank you.
Shalom, Rabbi.
Assalamu alaikum.
Bye. Thanks, guys.
Hasta luego.
Thanks, guys.
God bless
Thank
you.
you all.